External inspection revealed no further anomaly. All else he observed the doctor recorded faithfully, wondering throughout at the distress he felt. When he had finished, he understood it. Its cause was not the discovery of an entry wound that might bolster Waddleton's case, for the find had, within moments, revealed to him that, should he encounter anything he thought to be a mark of fragment penetration, he was going to ignore it. The damage Joe Allen had done was going to end here, with this last grand slaughter, and he would not extend to the impoverishment of his victim's survivors. His mind was now made up. For Jackson and the remaining 7, the external exams would be officially recorded as contraindicating the need for any external exam. No, the doctor's unease as he finished Jackson's external, as he wrote up his report and signed it, had a different source. His problem was that he did not believe the puncture in Jackson's thorax was a mark of fragment entry. He disbelieved this, and had no idea why he did so. Nor had he any idea why, once again, he felt afraid. He sealed the report. Jackson was now officially accounted for and done with. Then Dr. Winters took up the post-mortem knife and returned to the corpse. First the long, sawing slice, unzippering the mortal overcoat. Next 2 great square flaps of flesh reflected, scrawled laterally to the armpit's line, disrobing the chest. One hand grasping the flap's skirt, the other sweeping beneath it with the knife, flensing through the glassy tissue that joined it to the chest wall, and shaving all muscles from their anchorage to bone and cartilage beneath. Then the dismantling of the strong-box within, rib shears, so frank and forward a tool, like a gardener's. The steel beak bit through each rib's gristle anchor to the sternum centre-plate. At the sternum's crown-piece the collarbone's ends were knifed, pried, and sprung free from their sockets. The coffer unhasped, unhinged, a knife teased beneath the lid and levered it off. Some minutes later the doctor straightened up and stepped back from his subject. He moved almost drunkenly, and his age seemed scored more deeply in his face. With loathing haste he stripped his gloves off. He went to his desk, sat down, and poured another drink. If there was something like horror in his face, there was also a hardening in his mouth's line and the muscles of his jaw. He spoke to his glass. "So be it, Your Excellency. Something new for your humble servant. Testing my nerve." Johnson's pericardium, the shapely capsule containing his heart, should have been all but hidden between the big, blood-fat lobes of his lungs. The doctor had found it fully exposed, the lungs flanking it, wrinkled lumps less than a third of their natural bulk. Not only they, but the left heart and the superior mediastinal veins, all the regions that should have been grossly engorged with blood, were utterly drained of it. The doctor swallowed his drink and got out the photographs again. He found that Jackson had died on his stomach across the body of another worker, with the upper part of a third trapped between them. Neither these 2 subadjacent corpses nor the surrounding earth showed any stain of a blood loss that must have amounted to 2 litres. Possibly the pictures, by some trick of shadow, had failed to pick it up. He turned to the investigator's report, where Craven would surely have mentioned any significant amounts of bloody earth uncovered during the disinterment. The sheriff recorded nothing of the kind. Dr. Winters returned to the pictures. Ronald Pollock, Jackson's most intimate associate in the grave, had died on his back, beneath and slightly askew of Jackson, placing most of their torsos in contact, save where the head and shoulders of the third interposed. It seemed inconceivable that Pollock's clothing should lack any trace of such massive drainage from a death-mate thus embraced. The doctor rose abruptly, pulled on fresh gloves, and returned to Jackson. His hands showed a more brutal speed now, closing the great incision temporarily with a few widely spaced sutures. He replaced him in the vault and brought out Pollock, striding, heaving hard at the dead shapes in the shifting of them, thrusting always, so it seemed to him, just a step ahead of urgent thoughts he did not want to have, deformities that whispered at his back, emitting faint, chill gusts of putrid breath. He shook his head, denying, delaying, and pushed the new corpse onto the work-table. The scissors undressed Pollock in greedy bites. But at length, when he had scanned each scrap of fabric and found nothing like the stain of blood, he came to rest again, relinquishing that simplest desired resolution he had made such haste to reach. He stood at the instrument table, not seeing it, submitting to the approach of the half-formed things at his mind's periphery. The revelation of Jackson's shriveled lungs had been more than a shock. He had felt a stab of panic, too, in fact the same curiously explicit terror of this place that had urged him to flee earlier. He acknowledged now that the germ of that quickly suppressed terror had been a premonition of this failure to find any trace of the missing blood. Whence the premonition? It had to do with a problem he had steadfastly refused to consider. The mechanics of so complete a drainage of the lungs' densely reticulated vascular structure. Could the earth's crude pressure by itself work so thoroughly, given only a single vent both slender and strangely curved? And then the photograph he had studied. It frightened him now to recall the image. Some covert meaning stirred within it, struggling to be seen. Dr. Winters picked the probe up from the table and turned again to the corpse. As surely and exactly as if he had already ascertained the wound's presence, he leaned forward and touched it, a small, neat puncture just beneath the xiphoid process. He introduced the probe. The wound received it deeply, in a familiar direction. The doctor went to the desk and took up the photograph again. Pollock's and Jackson's wounded areas were not in contact. The third man's head was sandwiched between their bodies at just that point. He searched out another picture, in which this third man was more central, and found his name inked in below his image. Joe Allen. Dreamingly, Dr. Winters went to the wide metal door, shoved it aside, entered the vault. He did not search, but went straight to the trestle where Sheriff Craven had paused some hours before. He found the same name on its tag. The body, beneath decay's spurious obesity, was trim and well-muscled. The face was square-cut, shelf-browed, with a vulpine nose skewed by an old fracture. The swollen tongue lay behind the teeth, and the bulge of decomposition did not obscure what the man's initial impact must have been. Handsome and open, his now waxen black eyes sly and convivial. "Say, good buddy, got a minute? I see you coming on the swing shift every day, don't I? Yeah, Joe Allen. Look, I know it's late. You want to get home, tell the wife you ain't been in there drinking since you got off, right? Oh yeah, I hear that. But this damn disappearance thing's got me so edgy, and I'd swear to God, just as I was coming here I seen someone moving around back of that frame house up the street. See how the trees thin out a little down back of the yard, where the moonlight gets in? That's right. Well, I got me this little popper here. Oh yeah, that's a beauty, we'll have it covered between us. I knew I could spot a man ready for some trouble. Couldn't find a patrol car anywhere on the street. Yeah, just down in here now to that clump of pine. Step careful, you can barely see. That's right." The doctor's face ran with sweat. He turned on his heel and walked out of the vault, heaving the door shut behind him. In the office's greater warmth, he felt the perspiration soaking his shirt under the smock. His stomach rasped with steady oscillations of pain, but he scarcely attended it. He went to Pollock and seized up the post-mortem life. The work was done with surreal speed, the laminae of flesh and bone recoiling smoothly beneath his desperate but unerring hands, until the thoracic cavity lay exposed, and in it the vampire-stricken lungs, 2 gnarled lumps of grey tissue. He searched no deeper, knowing what the heart and veins would show. He returned to sit at the desk, weakly drooping, the knife, forgotten, still in his left hand. He looked at his reflection in the window, and it seemed his thoughts originated with that fainter, more tenuous Dr. Winters, hanging like a ghost outside. What was this world he lived in? Surely in a lifetime he had not begun to guess, to feed in such a way. There was horror enough in this alone, but to feed thus, in his own grave. How had he accomplished it? Leaving aside how he had fought suffocation long enough to do anything at all. How was it to be comprehended? A greed that raged so hotly it would glut itself at the very threshold of its own destruction. That last feast was surely in his stomach still. Dr. Winters looked at the photograph, at Alan's head, snuggled into the other's middles, like a hungry suckling nuzzling to the sow. Then he looked at the knife in his hand. The hand felt empty of all technique. Its one impulse was to slash, cleave, obliterate the remains of this gluttonous thing, this Joe Allen. He must do this, or flee it utterly. There was no course between. He did not move. "I will examine him," said the ghost in the glass, and did not move. Inside the refrigeration vault there was a slight noise. No. It had been some hitch in the generator's murmur. Nothing in there could move. There was another noise, a brief friction against the vault's inner wall. The 2 old men shook their heads at one another. A catch clicked, and the metal door slid open. Behind the staring image of his own amazement, the doctor saw that a filthy shape stood in the doorway and raised its arms towards him in a gesture of supplication. From the shape came a whistling groan, the decayed fragment of a human voice. Pleadingly, Joe Allen worked his jaw and spread his purple hands. As if speech were a maggot struggling to emerge from his mouth, the blue tumescent face toiled, the huge tongue wallowed helplessly between the viscid lips. The doctor reached for the telephone, lifted the receiver. Its deadness to his ear meant nothing. He could not have spoken. The thing confronting him, with each least movement that it made, destroyed the very frame of sanity in which words might have meaning, reduced the world itself around him to a waste of dark and silence, a starlit ruin where already, everywhere, the alien and unimaginable was awakening to its new dominion. The corpse raised and reached out one hand as if to stay him, turned and walked toward the instrument table. Its legs were leaden, it rocked its shoulders like a swimmer, fighting to make its passage through gravity's dense medium. It reached the table and grasped it exhaustedly. The doctor found himself on his feet, crouched slightly, weightlessly still. The knife in his hand was the only part of himself he clearly felt, and it was like a tongue of fire, a crematory flame. Joe Allen's corpse thrust one hand among the instruments. The thick fingers with a queer simian ineptitude brought up a scalpel. Both hands clasped the little handle and plunged the blade between the lips, as a thirsty child might a popsicle, then jerked it out again, slashing the tongue. Turbid fluid splashed down to the floor. The jaw worked stiffly. The mouth brought out words in a wet, ragged hiss. "Please, help me. Trapped in this." One dead hand struck the dead chest. "Starving." "What are you?" "Please, help me. Trapped in this." One dead hand struck the dead chest. "Starving." "What are you?" "Traveller. Not of earth. An eater of human flesh, a drinker of human blood. No, No, hiding only, am small, shape hideous to you, feared death. You brought death. The doctor spoke with a calm of perfect disbelief, himself as incredible to him as the thing he spoke with. It shook its head, the dull, popped eyes glaring with an agony of thwarted expression. Killed none. Hid in this, not to be killed. 5 days now. Drowning in decay. Free me, please. No. You have come to feed on us. You're not hiding in fear. We're your food, your meat and drink. You fed on those 2 men within your grave, their grave. For you, a delay. In fact, a diversion that has ended the hunt for you. No, no. Used men already dead. For me, 5 days, starvation. Even less, fed only from need. Horrible necessity. The spoiled vocal instrument made a mangled gasp of the last word. An inhuman snake-pit noise the doctor felt as a cold flicker of ophidian tongues within his ears, while the dead arms moved in a sodden approximation of the body language that swears truth. No, the doctor said. You killed them all, including your tool, this man. What are you? Panic erupted in the question that he tried to bury by answering himself instantly. Resolute, yes, that surely. You used death for an escape route. You need no oxygen, perhaps. Extracted more than my need from gases of decay, a lesser component of our metabolism. The voice was gaining distinctness, developing makeshifts for tones lost in the agonal rupturing of the valves and stops of speech, more effectively wresting vowel and consonant from the putrid tongue and lips. At the same time, the body's crudity of movement did not quite obscure a subtle, incessant experimentation. Fingers flexed and stirred, testing the give of tendons, groping the palm for old points of purchase and counter-pressure there. The knees, with cautious repetitions, assessed the new limits of their articulation. What was the sphere? My ship! Its destruction! Our first duty, facing discovery. Fear touched the doctor, like a slug climbing his neck. He had seen, as it spoke, a sharp, spastic activity of the tongue, a pleating and shrinkage of its bulk as the tug of some inward adjustment. No chance to re-enter. Leaving this body takes far too long. Not even time to set it for destruct. Must extrude as cilium, chemical key to broach hull shield. In shaft was my only chance to halt my host. Though the dead mask hung expressionless, conveyed no irony, the thing's articulacy grew uncannily. Each word was more smoothly shaped, nuances of tone creeping into its speech. Its right arm tested its wrist as it spoke, and the scalpel the hand still held cut white sparks from the air, while the word host seemed itself a little razor-cut, an almost teasing abandonment of fiction preliminary to attack. But the doctor found that fear had gone from him. The impossibility with which he conversed, and was about to struggle, was working in him an overwhelming amplification of his life's long, helpless rage at death. He found his parochial pity for Earth alone stretched to the transstellar scope this traveller commanded, to the whole cosmic trash-yard with its bulldozed multitudes of corpses, galactic wheels of carnage, stars, planets with their most majestic generations, all trash, cracked bones, and foul rags that pooled, settled, reconcatenated in futile symmetries gravid with new multitudes of briefly animate trash. And this, standing before him now, was the death it was given him particularly to deal. His might was being called in by the universal treasury of death, and Dr. Winters found himself, an old healer, on fire to pay. His own more lethal blade tugged at his hand with its own sharp appetite. He felt entirely the examiner once more, knew the precise cuts he would make, swiftly and without error. Very soon now, he thought, and coolly probed for some further insight before its onslaught. Why must your ship be destroyed, even at the cost of your host's life? We must not be understood. The livestock must not understand what is devouring them. Yes, Doctor, not all at once, but one by one. You will understand what is devouring you. That is essential to my feast. The doctor shook his head. You are in your grave already, traveller. That body will be your coffin. You will be buried in it a second time, for all time. The thing came one step nearer and opened its mouth. The flabby throat wrestled as with speech, but what sprang out was a slender white filament, more than whip-fast. Dr. Winters saw only the first flicker of its eruption, and then his brain novaed, thinning out at light speed to a white nullity. When the doctor came to himself, it was in fact to a part of himself only. Before he had opened his eyes he found that his wakened mind had repossessed proprioceptively only a bizarre truncation of his body. His head, neck, left shoulder arm, arm and hand declared themselves. The rest was silence. When he opened his eyes, he found that he lay supine on the gurney, and naked. Something propped his head. A strap bound his left elbow to the gurney's edge, a strap he could feel. His chest was also anchored by a strap, and this he could not feel. Indeed, save for its active remnant, his entire body might have been bound in a block of ice, so numb was it, and so powerless was he to compel the slightest movement from the least part of it. The room was empty, but from the open door of the vault there came slight sounds. The creak and soft frictions of heavy tarpaulin shifted to accommodate some business involving small clicking and kissing noises. Tears of fury filled the doctor's eyes. Clenching his one fist at the starry engine of creation that he could not see, he ground his teeth and whispered in the hot breath of strangled weeping. Take it back. This dirty little shred of life. I throw it off gladly, like the filth it is. The slow knock of boot soles loudened from within the vault, and he turned his head. From the vault door Joe Allen's corpse approached him. It moved with new energy, though its gait was grotesque, a ducking, hitching progress, jerky with circumventions of decayed muscle, while above this galvanized, struggling frame, the bruise-coloured face hung inanimate, an image of detachment. With terrible clarity the thing was revealed for what it was. A damaged hand-puppet vigorously worked from within, and when that frozen face was brought to hang above the doctor, the reeking hands, with the light, solicitous touch of friends at sick-beds, rested on his naked thigh. The absence of sensation made the touch more dreadful than it felt. It showed him that the nightmare he still desperately denied at heart had annexed his body while he, holding head and arm free, had already more than half drowned in its mortal paralysis. There, from his chest on down, lay his nightmare part, a nothingness freely possessed by an unspeakability. The corpse said. "Rotten blood. Thin nourishment. I had only 1 hour alone before you came. I fed from my neighbour to my left, barely had strength to extend a siphon. Fed from the right while you worked. Tricky going. You are alert. I expected Dr. Parsons. The energy needs of animating this." One hand left the doctor's thigh and smote the dusty overalls. "And of host transfer, very high. Once I have you synapsed, I will be near starvation again." A sequence of unbearable images unfolded in the doctor's mind, even as the robot carrion turned from the gurney and walked to the instrument table. The sheriff's arrival just after dawn, alone of course, since Craven always took thought for his deputy's rest, and because on this errand he would want privacy to consider any indiscretion on behalf of the miner's survivors that the situation might call for. Craven's finding his old friend, supine and alarmingly weak, his hurrying over, his leaning near. Then somewhat later a police car containing a rack of still wet bones might plunge off the highway above some deep spot in the gorge. The corpse took an evidence box from the table and put the scalpel in it. Then it turned and retrieved the mortuary knife from the floor and put that in as well, saying as it did so, without turning, "The sheriff will come in the morning. You spoke like close friends. He will probably come alone." The coincidence with his thoughts had to be accident, but the intent to terrify and appall him was clear. The tone and timing of that patched-up voice was unmistakably deliberate. Sly probes that sought his anguish specifically, sought his mind's personal centre. He watched the corpse, over at the table, dipping an apish but accurate hand and plucking up rib shears, scissors, clamps, adding all to the box. He stared, momentarily emptied by shock of all but the will to know finally the full extent of the horror that had appropriated his life. Joe Allen's body carried the box to the work table beside the gurney, and the expressionless eyes met the doctor's. "I have gambled. A grave gamble. But now I have won. At risk of personal discovery, we are obliged to disconnect, contract, hide as well as possible in the host body. Suicide in effect. I disregarded situational imperatives, despite starvation before disinterment and subsequent autopsy being all but certain. I caught up with the crew, tackled Pollock and Jackson microseconds before the blast. I computed 5 days' survival from this cache. I could disconnect at limit of my strength to do so, but otherwise I would chance autopsy, knowing the doctor was an alcoholic, incompetent. And now see my gain. You are a prize host. Through you, I can feed with near impunity even when killing is too dangerous. Safe meals are delivered to you still warm." The corpse had painstakingly aligned the gurney parallel to the work table, but offset, the table's foot extending past the gurney's, and separated from it by a distance somewhat less than the reach of Joe Allen's right arm. Now the dead hands distributed the implements along the right edge of the table, save for the scissors and the box. These the corpse took to the table's foot, where it set down the box and slid the scissors' jaws round one strap of its overalls. It began to speak again, and as it did, the scissors dismembered its cerements in unhesitating strokes. "The cut must be medical, forensically right, though a smaller one is easier. I must be careful of the pectoral muscles, or these arms will not convey me. I am no lava any more. Over 1,500 grams. To ease the nightmare's suffocating pressure, to thrust out some flicker of his own will against its engulfment, the doctor flung a question, his voice more cracked than the other's now was. Why is my arm free? The last fine neural splicing needs a sensory motor standard to perfect my brain's fit to yours. Lacking this eye-hand coordinating check, only a much coarser control of the host's characteristic motor patterns is possible. This done, I flush out the paralytic, unbind us, and we are free together. The grave clothes had fallen in a puzzle of fragments, and the cadaver stood naked, its dark, gas-rounded contours making it seem like some sleek marine creature, ruddered with the black-veined, gas-distended sex. Again the voice had teased for his fear, had uttered the last word with a savouring protraction, and now the doctor's cup of anguish brimmed over. Horror and outrage wrenched his spirit in brutal alternation, as if trying to tear it naked from its captive frame. He rolled his head in this deadlock, his mouth beginning to split with the slow birth of a mind-emptying outcry. The corpse watched this, giving a single nod that might have been approbation. Then it mounted the work-table, and with the concentrated caution of some practised convalescent re-entering his bed, lay on its back. The dead eyes again sought the living, and found the doctor staring back, grinning insanely. "Clever corpse!" the doctor cried. "Clever, carnivorous corpse! Able alien! Please don't think I'm criticizing. Who am I to criticize? A mere arm and shoulder, a talking head, just a small piece of a pathologist. But I'm confused." He paused, savouring the monster's attentive silence and his own buoyancy in the hysterical levity that had unexpectedly liberated him. "You are going to use your puppet there to pluck you out of itself and put you on me, but once he's pulled you from your driver's seat, won't he go dead, so to speak, and drop you? You could get a nasty knock. Why not set a plank between the tables? The puppet opens the door, and you scuttle, ooze, lurch, flop, slither, as the case may be, across the bridge. No messy spills, and in any case, isn't this an odd, rather clumsy way to get around among your cattle? Shouldn't you at least carry your own scalpels when you travel? There's always the risk you'll run across that one host in a million that isn't carrying one with him." He knew his jibes would be answered to his own despair. He exulted, but solely in the momentary bafflement of the predator, in having for just a moment mocked its gloating assurance to silence, and marred its feast. Its right hand picked up the post-mortem knife beside it, and the left wedged a roll of gauze beneath Alan's neck, lifting the throat to a more prominent arch. The mouth told the ceiling. "We retain larval form till entry of the host. As larvae, we have locomotor structures and sense buds usable outside our ship's sensory amplifiers. I waited coiled round Joe Allen's bed-leg till night, entered by his mouth as he slept." Allen's hand lifted the knife, held it high above the dull, quick eyes, turning it in the light. "Once lodged, we have 3 instars to adult form," the voice continued absently. The knife might have been a mirror from which the corpse read its features. "Larvae We have only a sketch of our full neural tap. Our metamorphosis is cued and determined by the host's endosomatic ecology. I matured in 3 days. Alan's wrist flexed, tipping the knife's point downmost. Most supreme adaptations are purchased at the cost of inessential capacities. The elbow pronated and slowly flexed, hooking the knife bodyward. Our hosts are all sentients, eco-dominants, are already carrying the baggage of coping structures for the planetary environment we find them in. Limbs, sensory portals. The fist planted the fang of its tool under the chin, tilted it, and rode it smoothly down the throat, the voice proceeding unmarred from under the furrow that the steel ploughed. Somatic envelopes, instrumentalities. Down the sternum, diaphragm, abdomen the stainless blade painted its stripe of gaping muddy tissue. With our host's brain we inherit all these, the mastery of any planet, netted in its dominant cerebral nexus. Thus, our genetic codings are now all but disencumbered of such provisions. So swiftly that the doctor flinched, Joe Allen's hand slashed 4 lateral cuts from the great wound's axis. The seeming butchery left 2 flawlessly drawn thoracic flaps cleanly outlined. The left hand raised the left flap's hem, and the right coaxed the knife into the aperture, deepening it with small stabs and slices. The posture was a man's who searches a breast pocket, with the dead eyes studying the slow recoil of flesh. The voice, when it resumed, had geared up to an intenser pitch. Galactically, the caudate nerve-brain paradigm abounds, and the neural labyrinth is our dominion. Are we to make plank bridges and worm across them to our food? Are cockroaches greater than we for having legs to run up walls and antennae to grope their way? All the quaint hinged crutches that life sports. The stilts, fins, fans, springs, stalks, flippers, and feathers, all in turn so variously terminating in hooks, clamps, suckers, scissors, forks, or little cages of digits. And beside all the gadgets it concocts for wrestling through its worlds, it is all knobbed, whiskered, crested, plumed, vented, spiked, or measled over, with the perceptual gear for combining pittances of noise or colour from the environing plenitude. Invincibly calm and sure, the hands traded tool and tasks. The right flap eased back, revealing ropes of ingeniously spared muscle, while promising a genuine appearance once sutured back in place. Helplessly the doctor felt his delirious defiance bleed away, and a bleak fascination rebind him. We are the taps and relays that share the host's aggregate of afferent nerve impulse, precisely at its nodes of integration. We are the brains that peruse these integrations, integrate them with our existing banks of host-specific data, and lastly let their consequences flow down the motor pathway. Either the consequences they seek spontaneously, or those we wish to graft upon them. We are besides a streamlined, alimentary, circulatory system, and a reproductive apparatus, and more than this we need not be. The corpse had spread its bloody vest, and the feculent hands now took up the rib shears. The voice's sinister coloration of pitch and stress grew yet more marked. The phrases slid from the tongue with a cobra's seeking sway, winding their liquid rhythms round the doctor, till a gasp in his resistance should let them pour through to slaughter the little courage left in him. For in this form we have inhabited the densest brain web of 300 races, lain intricately snug within them, like thriving vine on trellis work. We've looked out from too many variously windowed masks to regret our own vestigial senses. None read their words definitively. Far better than our nomad's range and choice, than an unvarying tenancy of one poor set of structures. Far better to slip on as we do, whole living beings, and wear at once all of their limbs and organs, memories and powers, wear all these as tightly congruent to our wills as a glove is to the hand that fills it. The shears clipped through the gristle, stolid, bloody jaws monotonously feeding, stopping short of the sternoclavicular joint in the manubrium, where the muscles of the pectoral girdle have an important anchorage. No consciousness of the chordate type that we have found has been impermeable to our finesse. No dendritic pattern so elaborate we could not read its stitchwork and thread ourselves to match. Precisely map its each synaptic seam till we could loosen it and retailor all to suit ourselves. We have strutted costumed in the bodies of planetary autarchs, venerable mannequins of moral fashion, but cut of the universal cloth, the weave of fleet electric filaments of experience that we easily reshuttle to the warp of our wishes, whereafter, newly hemmed and gathered, their living fabric hung obedient to our bias, investing us with honour and influence unlimited. The tricky verbal melody through the corpse's deft, unfaltering self-dismemberment, the sheer neuromuscular orchestration of the compound activity, struck Dr. Winters with the detached enthrallment great keyboard performers could bring him. He glimpsed the alien's perspective, a Gulliver waiting in a Brobdingnagian grave, then marshalling a dead giant against a living, like a dwarf in a huge mechanical crane, feverishly programming combat on a battery of levers and pedals, waiting for the robot arms enactments, the remote, titanic impact of the foes. And he marvelled, filled with a bleak wonder at life's infinite strategy and plasticity. Joe Allen's hands reached into his half-opened abdominal cavity, reached deep below the uncut anterior muscle that was exposed by the shallow, spurious incision of the epidermis, till by external measure they were extended far enough to be touching his thighs. The voice was still as the forearms advertised a delicate rummaging with the buried fingers. The shoulders drew back. As the steady withdrawal brought the wrists into view, the dead legs tremoured and quaked with diffuse spasms. "You called your kind our food and drink, Doctor. If you were merely that, an elementary usurpation of your motor tracts alone would satisfy us, give us perfect cattle control. For what rarest word or subtlest behaviour is more than a flurry of varied muscles? That trifling skill was ours long ago. It is not mere blood that feeds this lust I feel now to tenant you. The craving for an intimacy the years will not stale. My truest feast lies in compelling you to feed in that way, It lies in the utter deformation of your will this will involve. Had gross nourishment been my prime need, then my grave mates, Pollock and Jackson, could have eked out 2 weeks of life for me, or more. But I scorned a cowardly parsimony in the face of death. I reinvested more than half the energy that their blood gave me in fabricating chemicals to keep their brains alive, and fluid-bathed with oxygenated nutriment. The corpse reached into its gaping abdomen, and out of its cloven groin the smeared hands pulled 2 long skeins of silvery filament. The material looked like masses of nerve fibre, tough and scintillant, for the weave of it glittered with a slight incessant movement of each single thread. Those nerve skeins were contracting. They thickened into 2 swollen nodes, while at the same time the corpse's legs tremoured and faintly twitched, as the bright vermiculate roots of the parasite withdrew from within Alan's musculature. When the nodes lay fully contracted, the doctor could just see their tips within the abdomen. Then the legs lay still as death. I had accessory neural taps only to spare, but I could access much memory and all of their cognitive responses, and having in my banks all the organ of Corti's electrochemical conversions of English words, I could whisper anything to them directly into the 8th cranial nerve. Those are our true feast, Doctor. Such bodiless electric storms of impotent cognition as I tickled up in those 2 little bone globes. I was forced to drain them just before disinterment, but they lived till then, and understood everything I did to them. When the voice paused, the dead and living eyes were locked together. They remained so a moment, and then the dead face smiled. It recapitulated all the horror of Alan's first resurrection, this waking of expressive soul in that purple death mask. And it was a demon soul the doctor saw awaken. The smile was barbed with fine, sharp hooks of cruelty at the corners of the mouth, while the barbed eyes beamed fond, languorous anticipation of his pain. Remotely Dr. Winters heard the flat sound of his own voice asking, "And Joe Allen?" "Oh, yes, Doctor. He is with us now, has been throughout. I grieve to abandon so rare a host. He is a true hermit philosopher, well read in 4 languages. He is writing a translation of Marcus Aurelius. He was, I mean, in his free time." Long minutes succeeded of the voice accompanying the surreal self-autopsy, but the doctor lay resigned, emptied of reactive power. Still the full understanding of his fate reverberated in his mind as the parasite sketched his future for him in that borrowed voice. And it did not stop haunting Winters. The sense of what a virtuoso this entity was, how flawlessly this mass of neural fibres played the tricky instrument of human speech. As flawlessly as it had puppeteered the corpse's face into that ghastly smile, and with the same artistic aim, to waken, to amplify, to ripen its host-to-be's outrage and horror. The voice, with ever more melody and gloating verve, sent waves of realization through the doctor, amplifications of the unspeakable. The parasite's race had traced and tapped the complex interface between the cortical integration of sense input and the neural output governing response. It had interposed its brain between, sharing consciousness while solely commanding the pathways of reaction. The host, the bottled personality, was mute and limbless for any least expression of its own will, while hellishly articulate and agile in the surface of the parasites. It was the host's own hands that bound and wrenched the life half out of his prey, his own loins that experienced the repeated orgasms crowning his other despoliations of their bodies. And when they lay, bound and shrieking still, ready for the consummation, it was his own strength that hauled the smoking entrails from them, and his own intimate tongue and guzzling mouth he plunged into the rank, palpitating feast. And the doctor had glimpses of the racial history that underlay the alien's predatory present. Glimpses of a dispassionate, inquiring breed, so advanced in the analysis of its own mental fabric that, through scientific commitment and genetic self-sculpting, it had come to embody its own model of perfected consciousness. It had grown streamlined to permit its entry of other beings and its direct acquisition of their experiential worlds. All strictest scholarship at first, until there matured in the disembodied scholars their long germinal and now blazing, jealous hatred for all lesser minds rooted and clothed in the soil and sunlight of solid particular worlds. The parasite spoke of the cerebral music, the symphonies of agonized paradox that were its invasion's chief plunder. The doctor felt the truth behind this grandiloquence. The parasite's actual harvest from the systematic violation of encoffined personalities was the experience of a barren supremacy of means over lives more primitive, perhaps, but vastly wealthier in the vividness and passionate concern with which life for them was imbued. The corpse had reached into its thorax, and with its dead hands aided the parasite's retraction of its upper body root system. More and more of its livid mass had gone dead, until only its head and the arm nearer the doctor remained animate, while the silvery, worming mass grew in its bleeding abdominal nest. Then Joe Allen's face grinned, and his hand hoisted up the nude, regathered parasite from his sundered gut and held it for the doctor to view, his tenant-to-be. Winters saw that from the squirming mass of nerve cord one thick filament still draped down, remaining anchored in the canyoned chest toward the upper spine. This, he understood, would be the remote control line by which it could work at a distance the crane of its old host's body, transferring itself to Winters by means of a giant apparatus it no longer inhabited. This, he knew, was his last moment. Before his own personal horror should begin and engulf him, he squarely met the corpse's eyes and said, "Goodbye, Joe Allen. Eddie Sykes, I mean. I hope he gave you strength, the golden Marcus. I love him too. You are guiltless. Peace be with you at the last." The demon smile stayed fixed, but effortlessly Winters looked through it to the real eyes, those of the encoffined man, tormented eyes, foreseeing death, and craving it. The grinning corpse reached out its viscid cargo, a seething, rippling, multinodular lump that completely filled the erstwhile logger's roomy palm. It reached this across and laid it on the doctor's groin. He watched the hand set the bright Medusa's head, his new self, on his own skin, but felt nothing. He watched the dead hand return to the table, take up the scalpel, reach back over and make a 12-inch incision up his abdomen along his spinal axis. It was a deep, slow cut, sectioning just straight down through the abdominal wall, and it proceeded in the eerie, utter absence of physical sensation. The moment this was done, the fibre that had stayed anchored in the corpse snapped free, whipped back across the gap, and rejoined the main body that now squirmed towards the incision, its port of entry. The corpse collapsed, emptied of all innervating energy. It sagged slack and flaccid, of course. Or had it? Why was it? That nearer arm was supinated, both elbow and wrist at the full upturned twist. The palm lay open, offering. The scalpel still lay in the palm. Simple death would have dropped the arm earthward. It would now hang slack. With a blaze, like a nova of light, Winters understood. The man, Sykes, had, for a microsecond before his end, repossessed himself, had flung a dying impulse of his will down through his rotten, fading muscles, and had managed a single independent gesture in the narrow interval between the demon's departure and his own death. He had clutched the scalpel and flung out his arm, locking the joints as life left him. It rekindled Winter's own will, lit a fire of rage and vengefulness. He had caught hope from his predecessor. How precariously the scalpel lay on the loosened fingers! The slightest tremor would unfix the arm's joints. It would fall and hang and drop the scalpel down farther than hell's deepest recess from his grasp. And he could see that the scalpel was just, only just, in the reach of his fingers at his forearm's fullest stretch from the bound elbow. The horror crouched on him, and, even now slowly feeding its trunk line into his groin incision, at first stopped the doctor's hand with a pang of terror. Then he reminded himself that, until implanted, the enemy was a senseless mass, bristling with plugs, with input jacks for senses, but, until installed in the physical amplifiers of eyes and ears, an utterly deaf, blind monad that waited in a perfect solipsism between two captive sensory envelopes. He saw his straining fingers above the bright tool of freedom, thought with an insane smile of God and Adam on the Sistine ceiling, and then, with a lifespan of surgeon's fine control, plucked up the scalpel. The arm fell and hung. "Sleep," the doctor said. "Sleep revenged." But he found his retaliation harshly reined in by the alien's careful provisions. His elbow had been fixed with his upper arm almost at right angles to his body's long axis. His forearm could reach his hand inward and present it closely to the face, suiting the parasite's need of an eye-hand coordinative check, but could not, even with the scalpel's added reach, bring its point within 4 inches of his groin. Steadily the parasite fed in its tap line. It would usurp motor control in 3 or 4 minutes at most, to judge by the time its extrication from Alan had taken. Frantically, the doctor bent his wrist inward to its limit, trying to pick through the strap where it crossed his inner elbow. Sufficient pressure was impossible, and the hold so awkward that even feeble attempts threatened the loss of the scalpel. Smoothly the root of alien control sank into him. It was a defenseless thing of jelly against which he lay lethally armed, and he was still doomed. A preview of all his thrall's impotence to be. But of course there was a way. Not to survive, but to escape and to have vengeance. For a moment he stared at his captor, hardening his metal in the blaze of hate it lit in him. Then, swiftly, he determined the order of his moves, and began. He reached the scalpel to his neck and opened his superior thyroid vein, his inkwell. He laid the scalpel by his ear, dipped his finger in his blood, and began to write on the metal surface of the gurney, beginning by his thigh and moving toward his armpit. Oddly, the incision of his neck, though this was muscularly awake, had been painless, which gave him hopes that raised his courage for what remained to do. When he had done, the message read, "Alien, in, me, cut, kill." He wanted to write goodbye to his friend, but the alien had begun to pay out smaller auxiliary filaments collaterally with the main one, and all now lay in speed. He took up the scalpel, rolled his head to the left, and plunged the blade deep in his ear. Miracle. Last accidental mercy. It was painless. Some procedural, highly specific anesthetic was in effect. With careful plunges, he obliterated the right inner ear and then thrust silence with equal thoroughness into the left. The slashing of the vocal cords followed, then the tendons in the back of the neck that held it erect. He wished he were free to unstring knees and elbows, too, but it could not be. But, blinded, deaf, with centres of balance lost, with only rough motor control, all these conditions should fetter the alien's escape. Should it in the first place manage the reanimation of a bloodless corpse in which it had not yet achieved a fine-tuned interweave. Before he extinguished his eyes, he paused, the scalpel poised above his face, and blinked them to clear his aim of tears. The right, then the left, both retinas meticulously carved away, the yolk of vision quite scooped out of them. The scalpel's last task, once it had tilted the head sideways to guide the blood flow absolutely clear of possible effacement of the message, was to slash the external carotid artery. When this was done, the old man sighed with relief and laid his scalpel down. Even as he did so, he felt the deep inward prickle of an alien energy, something that flared, crackled, flared, groped for, but did not quite find its purchase. And inwardly, as the doctor sank towards sleep, cerebrally, as a voiceless man must speak, he spoke to the parasite these carefully chosen words. "Welcome to your new house. I'm afraid there's been some vandalism. The lights don't work, and the plumbing has a very bad leak. There are some other things wrong as well. The neighborhood is perhaps a little too quiet, and you may find it hard to get around very easily. But it's been a lovely home to me for 57 years, and somehow I think you'll stay." The face, turned toward the body of Joe Allen, seemed to weep scarlet tears, but its last movement before death was to smile.